Islam is often spoken about with certainty, confidence, and absolute truth claims, but what happens when we pause, slow down, and ask the questions many people are afraid to ask, questions not meant to attack, but to understand, such as why a faith revealed over 1400 years ago still claims relevance in a world shaped by artificial intelligence, global ethics, and rapidly changing moral frameworks, and how a religion rooted in 7th century Arabia speaks to modern ideas of freedom, gender equality, and individual choice. Why does Islam insist that truth is singular while humanity experiences reality in plural ways, and if God is all-merciful, why is disbelief portrayed as the gravest sin? How do we reconcile divine justice with eternal punishment, especially when belief itself is influenced by birthplace, culture, language, and exposure? If Islam emphasizes free will, how do we understand divine decree without falling into fatalism? Why is questioning encouraged in early Islamic history yet discouraged in many modern Muslim societies? How did a faith that once led the world in science, philosophy, and debate become associated with fear of doubt and intellectual stagnation? Why does Islam claim to honor women spiritually yet struggle culturally with issues of consent, education, and autonomy? How should Muslims interpret verses revealed for specific historical contexts in a globalized world without distorting divine intent? If the Quran is perfect and timeless, why do scholars still disagree so deeply on law, punishment, and governance? Why does Islam emphasize intention over action yet judge actions so strictly? How do we understand jihad beyond headlines without denying the uncomfortable historical realities tied to conquest and power? Why does Islam reject nationalism yet exist today within nation states that weaponize religion? If Islam is truly a religion of peace, why has peace been so difficult to embody politically and socially? How do Muslims balance loyalty to faith with loyalty to universal human values? Why is the Prophet Muhammad described as a mercy to mankind, yet his life is often reduced to selective narratives that ignore complexity? Why do many converts describe Islam as liberating, while many born Muslims describe it as restrictive? How can Islam claim to liberate humanity from ego, while religious identity itself becomes a source of superiority? Why is morality in Islam rooted in obedience rather than consequence, and can ethics exist independently of revelation? How should Muslims address modern questions of sexuality, freedom of expression, and belief without retreating into silence or hostility? If Islam is truth, should it fear scrutiny? And finally, if faith is meant to bring peace to the heart, why do so many people, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, carry fear, confusion, and guilt when engaging with it? And could it be that the toughest question about Islam is not whether it can withstand criticism, but whether its followers are brave enough to ask the questions that lead not away from faith, but deeper into its meaning? And as those questions linger, a second layer emerges, even more uncomfortable, asking whether the crisis facing Islam today is theological or human. Whether the divine message has been overshadowed by cultural habits mistaken for religion, and whether Muslims have confused certainty with arrogance and faith with fear. Why does a religion that begins with the command, read, often react defensively to reading opposing views? Why is disagreement seen as rebellion rather than a tradition that once fueled Islamic jurisprudence? How did compassion become conditional, mercy become selective, and piety become performative? If Islam teaches humility before God, why do believers sometimes speak as if they are God's representatives on earth? Why is the line between sacred law and political power so blurred that justice often becomes secondary to control? How can Islam call humanity toward unity while Muslims themselves are divided by sect, school, and identity? Why is spirituality reduced to rituals while ethics are negotiated away in daily life? If prayer is meant to soften the heart, why does cruelty sometimes coexist with religious devotion? Why do Muslims demand tolerance for Islam but struggle to tolerate dissent within it? How do we explain the gap between Quranic ideals and lived realities without blaming either blindly? If Islam teaches that God judges hearts, why do societies obsess over appearances? Why does fear of hell dominate conversations more than love of God? How can faith survive when doubt is treated as a disease rather than Doorway to deeper understanding. Why are young Muslims leaving not because they hate Islam, but because they feel unheard by it? How can Islam respond to modern science, psychology, and philosophy without retreating into denial or forced harmony? If truth is strong, should it not be able to stand without coercion? Why do Muslims often defend historical figures more passionately than present-day suffering humans? How do we separate reverence from revisionism? If Islam aims to establish justice, why do Muslims tolerate injustice when it comes from within their own ranks? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, what would Islam look like if Muslims stopped protecting its image and instead protected its principles? If they trusted that truth does not need guardians with clenched fists, but witnesses with open hearts, and if the real test of Islam in the modern world is not whether it can answer every question, but whether it can inspire the moral courage to live those answers honestly, even when doing so requires confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves. As the reflection deepens, a third and even more intimate set of questions surfaces, shifting the focus from institutions and societies to the individual soul, asking whether Islam as lived today invites transformation or merely conformity, whether faith has become a shield against self-criticism rather than a mirror forcing moral accountability. Why do believers memorize scripture faster than they internalize its ethics? Why is anger often louder than patience, judgment louder than mercy? How did a religion that calls for balance become associated with extremes of rigidity or neglect? Why is trust in God preached while fear governs decisions? How can Islam claim to free humans from worshipping creation when many end up worshipping scholars, traditions, or group identities? Why does spiritual sincerity struggle to survive in environments obsessed with labels like halal, haram, sunni, Shia, liberal, or conservative? If Islam teaches that God is closer than one's jugular vein, why do so many feel distant, anxious, or unworthy? How does one distinguish between guilt that reforms and guilt that crushes? Why is repentance spoken of endlessly yet forgiveness rarely practiced socially? How can Islam nurture inner peace when public religiosity often fuels comparison and competition? Why is silence about injustice easier than speaking truth to power? If Islam teaches accountability on the day of judgment, why is accountability avoided in this world? How can Muslims preach patience while refusing to listen? Why does sincerity fade when religion becomes identity politics? How do we raise children who love God rather than fear community backlash? If Islam is meant to heal hearts, why do many experience it first as pressure before they experience it as mercy? How do we reclaim worship as presence rather than performance? How do we revive Isin in a time obsessed with arguments over fiqh? And in the end, perhaps the most unsettling realization is that the hardest questions about Islam are not asked by its enemies but by those who wish to live it truthfully, because genuine faith does not demand the absence of doubt, but the courage to face it honestly, trusting that a religion rooted in divine wisdom does not collapse under sincere questioning, but is refined by it, just as the believer is refined not by certainty alone, but by the lifelong struggle to align belief, character, and compassion into a faith that is not only declared, but deeply lived. As the inquiry reaches its fourth stage, it begins to challenge not only belief and behavior, but the very way Islam is defended and presented to the world, asking whether the obsession with proving Islam right has quietly replaced the obligation to live Islam well. Why do Muslims rush to argument before embodying ethics? Why is criticism seen as an attack rather than an opportunity for moral growth? How did dawah become more about winning debates than healing hearts? If Islam claims universality, why is its message often trapped in cultural language that outsiders cannot penetrate? Why is pain dismissed when it comes from former believers instead of being listened to with empathy? How can Islam call people toward truth while refusing to acknowledge the wounds caused in its name? Why is history romanticized instead of examined honestly? How do Muslims confront slavery, patriarchy, and power struggles in early Islamic history without feeling that honesty threatens faith? If God is truth, why does truth sometimes feel dangerous? Why do we defend scholars' mistakes more fiercely than victims of injustice? How do we teach young Muslims that loving Islam does not require denying Reality: why does religious authority fear decentralization in an age where access to knowledge is inevitable? How can Islam remain spiritually alive when it is reduced to slogans, reactions, and identity defense? Why is silence often chosen over reform when silence itself becomes a form of betrayal? If Islam teaches enjoining good and forbidding evil, why is that principle applied selectively? How do Muslims distinguish between unity and uniformity? Why does disagreement fracture communities instead of enriching them? How can Islam inspire hope when its public image is shaped by constant outrage and victimhood narratives? And finally, perhaps the most confronting question of this stage is whether Muslims truly trust God's promise that truth will prevail, or whether fear has led them to believe that Islam survives only if it is constantly protected from uncomfortable conversations, when in reality a faith confident in its divine source should be the least afraid of honesty, humility, and self-correction, knowing that strength is not proven by silence or suppression, but by the willingness to face reality with moral clarity and unwavering integrity. The question move beyond defense and reform into purpose and destiny, asking what Islam ultimately wants from the human being: not compliance, not fear, not tribal loyalty, but something far more demanding and profound, and whether Muslims have lost sight of that goal. Is Islam meant to create followers who obey rules, or souls who embody justice even when it costs them comfort? Why is success measured by numbers, visibility, and dominance rather than by character, trust, and moral courage? How did the pursuit of power overshadow the pursuit of wisdom? If Islam teaches that this world is temporary, why do believers cling so tightly to status, authority, and control? Why is sacrifice praised in words but avoided in practice? How can Islam guide humanity toward balance when Muslims themselves struggle with excessive anger, excessive certainty, excessive reaction? Why does the Quran constantly call people to reflect on creation while many reduce faith to inherited answers? If Islam teaches responsibility for the earth, why is environmental ethics rarely part of religious discourse? How do Muslims reconcile economic injustice, corruption, and exploitation with daily acts of worship? Why does charity sometimes feel like a transaction rather than solidarity? How can Islam address global suffering without retreating into selective empathy? Why are some lives mourned loudly while others are ignored quietly? If Islam claims to stand with the oppressed, why do Muslims hesitate when oppression comes from their own communities or leaders? How does one live Islam in a world where truth is complex, power is unequal, and silence is rewarded? Why is patience misunderstood as passivity and trust in God confused with inaction? If accountability before God is inevitable, why is moral responsibility delayed? And perhaps the most defining question of this final stretch is whether Islam will be remembered in our time as a faith that demanded loyalty to its image, or as a faith that demanded honesty, courage, and compassion from its followers. Because in the end, Islam does not need perfect believers or flawless societies, but conscious human beings willing to struggle sincerely toward justice, mercy, and truth, even when that struggle exposes their own contradictions, knowing that faith was never meant to make life easy, but to make it meaningful.